very quickly. We will have different standards. It will be harder and harder to fight together again. The Secretary General Rasmussen in Munich last weekend referred to this problem when he spoke of the need for connected forces. And yet exercises are increasingly things that nations alone cannot afford. So can NATO not therefore also be together in training and exercising, bringing American troops back to Europe on a regular rotational basis, training with our partners, maintaining a basic line of interoperability so that we can surge again? Next challenge, we can't unfortunately insure ourselves any longer against everything. We have to decide where we can afford to take risks because the contingency may be catastrophic, interstate war, weapons of mass destruction, but is not likely to happen in the immediate future. So we have warning time to reconstitute. And where the challenge is immediate, tomorrow, today, terrorism, and where we therefore cannot take risks and have to have a rapid response capability. But the days when we could try to keep capabilities for every mission, or where every mission was equally important, those days are over. And that means therefore that NATO is going to have to do something which it hasn't done enough of in the past. We're going to have to be better at predicting the future. The past was basically waiting for the crisis to happen and then being a responder of last resort when diplomacy and everything else had failed, which often meant dealing with the situation in the worst possible circumstances and in the most long-term, bloody and costly way. We can't afford that luxury any longer in the age of austerity. So we're going to have to be much better at sharing intelligence, using net assessment, using policy planning, using political consultations in the alliance to have a far better idea where the next threat is coming from and using political means to ward it off. In other words, NATO has to become an organization which doesn't have to fire shots in order to demonstrate its relevance, but does it increasingly by being politically alert and politically astute. Now, I agree entirely with what Hans-Gert has said. We need to use our defense capabilities much better. The fact of the matter is that we cannot blame our lack of capability only on budget cuts. That's too facile. There is still enormous waste in the defense sector. And if you look at the pure statistics, Europe, Canada and the United States spend over 50% of global defense budgets, even with the cuts. Even with the cuts, the United States will still spend more money than the next 10 countries in the world combined. Even with the cuts, the EU is the second largest military spender, spending more than Russia, China, India, Brazil, all of the BRICS combined. You cannot tell me with those resources we cannot do a half-reasonable job of maintaining core capabilities. If we merge, of course, have a division of labour, role specialisation, I won't bore you, but all of the things that we call smart defence. Hans-Gert is right. I mean, these are not new ideas. These are things that we've been talking about in NATO conferences for decades, but without ever putting them in place. But now is the time that we have to start doing that, and we have to have a lead, and I totally agree, Hans-Gert, that we have to have synergy between the EU's pooling and sharing and NATO's smart defence. So, with smart planning as well as smart defence, there is absolutely no reason why NATO cannot slim down while still maintaining a core capability to cover immediate threats and to reconstitute quickly to cover major contingencies. Secondly, adapting NATO to the security environment. The challenges that we are going to face over the next few years are going to be asymmetric. They are going to involve private individuals. And they are going to increasingly involve networks or hybrid threats, a situation where organised crime connects with drugs, that connects with terrorism, for example, and produces a threat. This means a totally different approach to security. Let me give you an example. The military have a very colourful expression. They say we have to go left of the bang. Let me explain. We have spent, ladies and gentlemen, billions of dollars dealing with the moment when an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan explodes, and the few seconds thereafter, the shock against a vehicle, the shock against protecting our troops. Billions of dollars dealing with 2 seconds of kinetic activity. We have suddenly woken up to the fact that by working with the customs, working with border guards, working with the shipping companies, and therefore preventing the import of nitroglycerine via Pakistan into Afghanistan, by disrupting the network, which costs only thousands of dollars, we are having infinitely more success than spending billions of dollars on the kinetic effect. That's a graphic example of the new way of dealing with security policy. We need to look at solutions which do not always involve deployment of military forces. Piracy. We are spending between $7 to $12 billion a year on naval operations in the Gulf of Aden to deal with a threat which basically generates about $150 million of ransom money every year. Now, again, I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing anything against piracy. Don't misunderstand me. Of course we should. The point I'm trying to make, however, is that there could be more cost-effective ways. Establishing courts, training Somali pirates, having more of a presence on the land, for instance, developing alternative livelihoods, putting private sector guards on ships. No ship with a private sector protection has ever been captured by pirates. So we need, therefore, to begin in NATO to look at these new threats and the different approaches where the military can be an added value, but not can be all of the solution. And I would argue that protecting the global commons, keeping the vital spaces of our industrial and commercial life open, space, land space, energy routes, Hans-Gert referred to this, cyberspace, keeping these things functioning, free from disruption, is going to be important. Now, the difference here, ladies and gentlemen, is you cannot deter these threats. You can't prevent people hacking into your systems. You can't prevent terrorist attacks, always. Deterrence doesn't work here. These things will happen. So the focus of NATO has to go from deterrence and reaction increasingly to resilience, prevention where we can, and what we call in football bounce back ability, the ability to recover quickly and to restore vital services immediately afterwards. For example, in the event of an Estonian-style cyber attack. Now, this is also going to mean a change in NATO's working culture. For example, a couple of months ago, we organized a meeting at NATO headquarters of the cyber czars in our countries. 90% of these people who came to this meeting had never been to NATO before. They weren't in defense ministries. They weren't in foreign ministries, NATO's traditional customers. They were in intelligence services, they were in the police, they were in interior ministries, they were in specialized government agencies. So we need to build the network of interlocutors to allow us to deal with these new threats. And don't forget the private sector. 90% of cyberspace is owned by the private sector. And one thing, ladies and gentlemen, that I predict in the 21st century, as governments cut their defense budgets, governments will cut their responsibility for large areas of security. The cyber is defended by the private sector, not by soldiers, banks, even government operations. Even where I was a few days ago at the government communications headquarters at Cheltenham, our biggest, if you like, surveillance agency, it's protected by the private sector, not by civil servants. Ships are protected by the private sector. Embassies are protected by the private sector. In my country, the United Kingdom, 25% of our security exports are now private sector services. So increasingly, the way we deal with threats of the future is going to be a much closer integration of private sector security and governmental security, and we need to think of that as well. Finally, because I promised to be short, we need to look at the new ways of security policy. Basically, we don't do things alone any longer. Everything that NATO does, we do with partners. Look at Afghanistan. Almost 20% of all of the forces come from partner countries. 50 countries in all. Biggest troop contributor per capita? Tonga. Tonga. Who would have thought of that? And you know these are big guys, so they're worth 2 or 3 normal individuals as well. Look at Libya. Sweden was completely integrated in NATO's operation. Some allies were not. Sweden is going to sign very soon a cosmic top secret agreement with NATO for the exchange of classified information. Sweden says that it wants to have its forces at the same level of readiness as NATO to be always able potentially to participate in a NATO operation. The difference between an ally and a non-ally is going. Australia is the 7th biggest contributor to our operation in Afghanistan. One of the things that NATO has done, which no other regional security organization has done, ladies and gentlemen, is to build this global network of partners. Burden sharing, legitimacy, bases, transit, overflights, whatever. NATO simply could not do its job these days without this network of partners. But what happens after 2014? What happens after ISAF? Do the Australians go home to Canberra? Do the New Zealanders go home to Wellington? Do we all say, it was nice while it lasted, see you on the next operation? I hope not. I think one of our biggest challenges is going to be to keep these like-minded partners involved in our security community on a permanent basis through, for example, cyber, non-proliferation, terrorism, intelligence sharing, interoperability, but we have to think how to do it. The other thing, the BRICS. Basically, the West does not sort of have an uninterrupted argument any longer. Look at Libya. We were fiercely criticized by Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa because of the NATO operation. Our view of the responsibility to protect was not their view of the responsibility to protect. They didn't think that it went to regime change. You look at Russia and China now vetoing the resolution on Syria. In other words, what we think are the legitimate rules of security business, look at missile defense with Russia. What we think is in the common interest is not perceived by the other guys, the emerging powers, as the legitimate common interest. And so NATO must not only be able to build partnerships with the easy countries, the like-minded ones, we're going to have to think harder about how we engage the more difficult but essential partners and what the norms are going to be. What is the extent of the responsibility to protect? How do we revise the non-proliferation treaty? Where is regime change justified? What are the norms of what you can do and cannot do in cyberspace, particularly with offensive cyber weapons? If we send drones into armed combat, because they're not soldiers and they don't get killed, in inverted commas, is that war or not war? Is war only when you have human beings involved, but not robots or machines? So we're going to have to think hard about how we position ourselves as a legitimate actor in a world in which other powers are becoming more assertive in security policy as well. So, I've stopped, I've finished. Those are the 3 big challenges. We all like in NATO to talk about I's or D's, so I've got 3 C's for you. We've got to be capable, we've got to be comprehensive in the way we look at our security problems, and we've got to be connected. But the biggest challenge of all is what I would call smart contraction. Let's not, because of budget cuts, retreat from NATO's strategic concept. Let's not, because of budget cuts, go back to the Cold War, hunker down in Europe, NATO, waiting for a Cold War scenario to re-emerge. That would not keep the US and Canada engaged in NATO for very long. Our partners are not interested either in a Eurocentric NATO very much. We have got to somehow get smaller, but while being able to still remain a relevant global security actor. Thank you.